The massive crystal towers of Zentara Prime stretched up into the purple sky like frozen lightning. Inside the biggest tower, 47 different alien species sat around a table that could have held a small city. The air buzzed with the sound of translators working overtime as creatures that looked nothing like each other tried to talk. About the same terrible problem, the Void War had been going on for 3 years now. The Harvesters, as everyone called them, were machines that ate entire planets. They came from the empty space between galaxies, black ships that moved like schools of fish and destroyed everything they touched. No one knew where they came from or what they really wanted, but everyone knew they had to be stopped. Admiral Kexthara stood 12 feet tall and looked like a giant lizard wearing a military uniform. His scales were dark green and his eyes glowed yellow when he got angry, which was most of the time. He was the head of the Vorthak military, and the Vorthak had been fighting wars for 10,000 years. They knew about fighting, and they knew about winning. "The numbers are clear," Kexthara said, his voice making the crystal walls shake. "We need every ship, every weapon, every soldier we can get. But we cannot waste time on species that will only get in our way." He turned his massive head toward the far corner of the room where 3 humans sat at a small table. They looked tiny compared to the other aliens. The Ilari were balls of pure energy that floated in the air. The Zephyrians looked like living crystals that changed colors when they talked. The Vorthak were giant lizards. The humans just looked like humans. Commander Jake Morrison had been in the military for 20 years, but he had never felt as small as he did right now. He wore his best uniform, the one with all his medals, but none of the aliens seemed to care. They had been talking for 6 hours about battle plans and troop movements, and not once had anyone asked what Earth could do to help. "The human fleet consists of 30 ships," Kexthara continued, reading from a datapad. "Their largest vessel is barely half the size of our smallest destroyer. Their weapons are chemical explosives and metal projectiles. They have no energy. Shields, no quantum computers, no dimensional drives. They are children playing with toys while we fight a real war." Dr. Lisa Bennett felt her face turn red. She was Earth's top expert on alien life, and she had spent 5 years learning about the other species in the galaxy. She knew that humans were new to space travel, but they were not stupid. They had ideas and ways of thinking that might help win this war, if anyone would listen. "Admiral," she said, standing up from her chair, "if I may speak." The room went quiet. 47 different types of aliens turned to look at her. Some had eyes, some had sensors, some had things she could not even understand. But they were all focused on her now. "The human military has experience with asymmetric warfare," she said. "We have fought wars where the enemy had better weapons and more soldiers. We have learned how to win anyway." A sound like breaking glass came from the Zephyrian section. Lisa realized they were laughing. "Your species has been in space for 200 years, said a voice that sounded like wind chimes. "We have been traveling between stars for 50,000 years. What could you possibly teach us about warfare?" "We have been fighting each other for our entire history," Lisa said. "Every war we ever fought taught us something new. We learned to adapt, to change, to find new ways to win when the old ways failed." More laughter came from different parts of the room. The Ilari made a sound like electricity crackling. The Vorthak made a noise like angry thunder. Only one section of the room stayed quiet. In the shadows behind the main table, something moved. It was hard to see at first because it was so still, but slowly a figure became visible. It was tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 arms. Most of its body was covered in scars, and its eyes were completely black. "Vakter," someone whispered. The name went around the room like a cold wind. Even the humans had heard of General Vakter, though they had never seen him before. He was a Krillian, a species that most people thought was extinct. He had been fighting wars since before most of the other species had discovered fire. He had been alive for over 3,000 years, and he had been in more battles than anyone could count. Vakter never spoke at the council meetings. He just sat in the shadows and watched. Some people said he was too old to fight anymore. Others said he was waiting for the right moment to share his wisdom. Most people forgot he was there at all. But now he was looking directly at the humans. Jake. Morrison felt those black eyes studying him and his team. There was something in that look that made him stand up straighter. It was not anger or contempt like he saw in the other aliens. It was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. "The Harvester fleet grows stronger every day," Kexthara said, bringing the room's attention back to him. "They have taken the Outer Rim systems and they are moving toward the core worlds. We estimate they will reach the capital systems within 2 months. We need to stop them before they get there." The discussion turned to battle plans and fleet movements. The Vorthak wanted to meet the Harvesters head-on with their biggest ships. The Ilari wanted to use their energy weapons to destroy the Harvester motherships. The Zephyrians had calculated the exact position where the fleets should meet for maximum effectiveness. Everyone had a plan, everyone except the humans. "What about Earth's forces?" Jake asked during a brief pause in the discussion. "What about them?" Kexthara replied without looking at him. "Where do you want us to position our ships? What role do you want us to play in the battle?" The Admiral's yellow eyes fixed on Jake with something that looked like pity. "Commander. Morrison, your ships are too small and too weak to be of any real use in a major battle. The best thing you can do is stay out of the way and let the real military forces handle this war." Jake felt his hands clench into fists. Next to him, Lisa was so angry she was shaking. The third human, Colonel Pete Davis, had been quiet all day, but now he looked like he wanted to punch something. "We came here to help," Jake said. "Earth may not have the biggest fleet, but we have good soldiers and good officers. We know how to fight. Fighting barbarians on a single planet is not the same as fighting a galactic war," Kexthara said. "This conversation is over." The Admiral turned away from the humans and started talking to the other species about supply lines and communication networks. It was clear that Earth was not going to be part of those discussions. Lisa looked around the room at all the different aliens. They were all so confident, so sure that their way was the only way to win. The Vorthak believed in strength. The Ilari believed in technology. The Zephyrians believed in perfect calculations. But none of them seemed to understand that there might be other ways to fight a war. In the shadows, Vakter continued to watch the humans. His forearms were crossed over his chest and his black eyes never blinked. He had seen a lot of wars and a lot of warriors, but these humans were different. Somehow, they did not have the biggest ships or the best weapons, but they had something else. Something that reminded him of battles from long ago. The meeting went on for 2 more hours. Plans were made, fleets were assigned, and battle strategies were discussed. Through it all, the humans sat in their corner and listened. They took notes and asked questions, but no one really answered them. They were observers at their own war. When the meeting finally ended, the aliens filed out of the room in their various ways. The Ilari floated away like living lightning. The Zephyrians moved like a slow rainbow. The Vorthak stomped out like dinosaurs in boots. The humans gathered their papers and prepared to leave. They had learned nothing useful and contributed nothing meaningful. They would return to their small ships and their chemical weapons and wait for the real military forces to win or lose the war for them. But as they reached the door, a voice spoke from the shadows. "Stay." They turned to see Vakter standing in the darkness, his forearms still crossed, his black eyes still watching. "I want to talk to you," the ancient warrior said. The alarm started screaming at 3 a.m, Galactic Standard Time. Captain Ryan Hayes was drinking coffee in the mess hall of the UN's Defiance when the red lights began flashing. He had been expecting this call for weeks, but it still made his stomach drop. "Captain, to the bridge," came the voice over the ship's communication system. "We have a problem." Ryan ran through the narrow corridors of his ship, past sleeping quarters and storage rooms filled with supplies they probably would never get to use. The Defiance was not a big ship. It was not even a particularly good ship. But it was his ship, and it was about to go into the biggest battle in galactic history. The bridge was already busy when he arrived. His crew was working at their stations, reading sensor data and checking weapon systems. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Park was standing at the main display, her face pale in the blue light from the screens. "Report," Ryan said. "They came out of dark space 20 minutes ago," Sarah said. "The Harvester fleet is bigger than we thought, much bigger." The main screen showed what looked like a black cloud moving between the stars, but Ryan knew it was not a cloud. It was ships. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. They were moving in perfect formation toward the core worlds, eating the light from the stars as they passed. "How long until they reach the defense line?" Ryan asked. 6 hours, Sarah said. "The Galactic Defense Force is moving to intercept, but the numbers are not good." "The Harvesters have at least 3 times as many ships as we do," Ryan looked at the tactical display. The combined fleets of 47 different species were moving to meet the enemy. It looked impressive until you compared it to the size of the Harvester Armada, then it just looked hopeless. "What are our orders?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "Admiral Kexthara wants all human ships to stay in the rear guard. We are supposed to protect the supply ships and stay out of the main battle." Ryan had expected this, but it still made him angry. The humans had 12 ships in the defense force. They were small ships with basic weapons, but they were still ships with crews who wanted to fight. Instead, they were being told to hide while everyone else did the real fighting. "Sir," said Lieutenant Tony Rodriguez from the weapons station, "I have an idea." Ryan turned to look at his weapons officer. Tony was young, maybe 25, and he had joined the Space Force because he wanted to see action. He had been disappointed to learn that most of space combat involves sitting around waiting for something to happen. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "The Harvesters have adaptive shields," Tony said. "They change their defenses based on what weapons are being used against them. But they have only fought energy weapons and plasma cannons so far," Ryan nodded. This was something they all knew. The Harvesters could adapt to any weapon system after being hit a few times. "It was one of the reasons they were so hard to kill, but we do not use energy weapons," Tony continued. "We use nuclear missiles and kinetic rounds, old-fashioned explosives, and metal bullets. Maybe their shields are not designed to handle that kind of attack." It was a good point. Human weapons were considered primitive by galactic standards, but primitive did not always mean ineffective. Sometimes it just meant different. "Sir," said the communications officer, "we are getting reports from the front line. The battle has started." The main screen changed to show the battle in real time. The Galactic Defense Force had met the Harvesters at the edge of the Kepler system, and the fighting was already intense. Beams of pure energy cut through space, like lasers, while plasma cannons fired bursts of superheated gas that could melt through starship hulls, but the Harvesters were adapting. Their shields were getting stronger with each attack. Ships that had been doing damage 10 minutes ago were now barely scratching the enemy's defenses. "The Vorthic flagship is taking heavy fire," Sarah reported. "They are requesting assistance." Ryan watched as the massive Vorthak dreadnought, a ship 5 times the size of the Defiance, was surrounded by smaller Harvester vessels. Its shields were failing, and its weapons were having no effect on the enemy. "Set course for the flagship," Ryan ordered. "Maximum speed." "Sir," Sarah said, "our orders are to stay with the supply ships." "Our orders are to protect the fleet," Ryan replied. "Right now, the fleet needs us more than the supply ships do." The Defiance turned away from the rear guard and accelerated toward the main battle. Around them, the other human ships followed. None of them had been ordered to join the fight, but none of them were willing to sit on the sidelines while their allies were being destroyed as they approached the battle. Ryan could see how bad things really were. The Harvesters were not just winning, they were dominating. Their black ships moved like a school of fish, coordinating their attacks perfectly. Every time the galactic forces tried a new tactic, the Harvesters adapted and countered it. "Target the Harvester command ship," Ryan ordered. "The big one in the center of their formation." "Sir," Tony said, "that ship is 3 times our size. Our weapons might not even scratch it." "Then we will have to get creative," Ryan replied. "Load nuclear torpedoes, full spread." The weapons officer looked shocked. Sir, nuclear weapons are banned in space combat. The radiation could harm our own ships. The radiation will not matter if we are all dead, Ryan said. Fire when ready. The Defiance shuddered as 6 nuclear torpedoes left their launch tubes. They streaked across space toward the Harvester command ship, their primitive guidance systems, making them almost impossible to track with advanced sensors. The Harvester ship tried to intercept them with defensive fire, but the torpedoes were too simple to be stopped by sophisticated countermeasures. They slammed into the enemy's hull and exploded in brilliant flashes of nuclear fire. The command ship staggered. Its shields flickered and went down. For the first time in the entire war, a Harvester ship had been seriously damaged. Direct hit? Tony reported, his voice filled with amazement. Their shields are down and they have hull breaches on multiple levels. But the victory was short-lived. The Harvester ship began to repair itself, its hull flowing like liquid metal to seal the breaches. Within minutes it would be back to full strength. All ships, this is Captain Hayes, Ryan said into his communicator. Target the damaged vessel. Hit it with everything you have before it can repair itself. The other human ships opened fire with their primitive weapons. Kinetic rounds made of solid metal punched through the Harvester's weakened defenses. Chemical explosives detonated against its hull. Railguns fired projectiles at incredible speed, creating impact craters that the ship's repair systems could not handle. The Harvester command ship began to break apart. Its perfect black hole cracked and split, exposing the mechanical systems inside. Sparks flew from damaged circuits, and pieces of the ship began to drift away into space. "We did it," Sarah said, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually hurt them." But their success had attracted attention. Other Harvester ships were turning toward the human fleet, their weapons charging for a counterattack. "Evasive maneuvers," Ryan ordered. "Do not let them get a lock on us." The Defiance twisted and turned through space, trying to avoid the energy beams that were cutting through the area where they had been moments before. The ship's hull groaned under the stress of the high-speed maneuvers, but it held together. Around them, the battle was changing. The other galactic species had seen what the humans accomplished, and they were starting to adapt their own tactics. The Vorthak began using their plasma cannons in short bursts instead of sustained beams. The Ilari started varying their energy frequencies randomly. The Zephyrians threw their perfect calculations out the window and began firing at whatever targets looked most vulnerable. Dr. Susan Clark was monitoring the battle from the UN's Resilience, another human ship that had joined the fight. She was not a military officer, but she was a psychologist, and she had been studying the Harvester behavior patterns since the war began. "Captain," she said to her ship's commander, "I think I know why our weapons are working." "Go ahead, Doctor." "The Harvesters are machines, but they are not just machines. They learn and adapt, which means they have some kind of artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence has limitations. It can only adapt to patterns it can recognize and predict." She paused to check her data as another wave of Harvester ships approached their position. "Human weapons are not just primitive," she continued. "They are chaotic. We do not fire in perfect patterns like the other species. We improvise, we make mistakes, we do things that do not make sense from a tactical standpoint. The Harvesters cannot adapt to chaos because chaos has no pattern to learn from. It was a revelation that changed everything. The human ships were not just effective because their weapons were different. They were effective because their entire approach to warfare was different, Lieutenant." Commander Tony Rodriguez had taken command of a boarding party that was preparing to attack a damaged Harvester ship. It was a crazy plan that no other species would have attempted. Space Marines were supposed to fight other Space Marines, not board enemy vessels in the middle of a battle, but humans had been boarding enemy ships for as long as they had been sailing oceans. They knew how to fight in close quarters, how to adapt to unexpected situations, how to keep going when everything went wrong. The battle had been raging for 12 hours when General Wachter finally spoke. His voice came over every communication channel in the galactic fleet, cutting through the noise of weapons fire and emergency alerts. Even in the middle of combat, everyone stopped what they were doing to listen. "I have seen 3,000 years of war," the ancient Krillian said. His voice was calm and steady, like an old teacher explaining something to children. "I have watched empires rise and fall. I have seen species that thought they were invincible become dust in the wind. I have learned that victory does not always belong to the strongest or the smartest." Admiral Kexthara was on the bridge of his flagship, trying to coordinate the retreat of his forces. The Vorthak fleet had lost half its ships, and the survivors were falling back toward the inner systems. When he heard Vaktar's voice, he stopped giving orders and turned to listen. "3 millennia ago, I fought in the First Void War," Vaktar continued. "The enemy then was different from the harvesters we face today, but the lesson was the same. We tried to fight them with our traditional methods. We used our best weapons, our finest strategies, our most advanced technology, and we lost." "Colonel?" Beth Turner was monitoring communications from her ship, the Un's Resilience. She had been studying the battle data, trying to understand why human tactics were working when everyone else's were failing. When she heard Vaktar mention the First Void War, she realized he was about to share knowledge that could change everything. "The Titan Empire had ships that could destroy planets," Vaktar said. "The crystal mines of Altair could calculate the movement of every particle in space. The energy dancers of the Spiral Nebula could become pure light and move faster than thought itself. They were all more advanced than we Krillians, but they all fell to the same enemy." On the Un's Defiance, Captain Ryan Hayes was listening while his crew repaired battle damage. They had been fighting for hours, using every trick they could think of to stay alive. Their ship was held together with spare parts and determination, but they were still fighting. "The enemy in that war was like the harvesters," Vaktar continued. "They adapted to everything we threw at them. Every weapon we used, every strategy we tried, became useless after a few battles. We were losing because we were predictable." The ancient warrior paused, and in that silence everyone in the fleet could hear the sound of their own breathing. Even the harvesters seemed to have stopped moving, as if they too were listening to the voice from the past. "Then I met a species I had never seen before," Vaktar said. "They were not the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. They came from a small world on the edge of the galaxy, and they had barely learned to travel between stars. But they had something that all our advanced civilizations had lost." Dr. Susan Clark was in the medical bay of her ship, treating wounded soldiers from the boarding party. She had been thinking about the patterns she observed in human behavior, trying to understand why humans fought differently from other species. When she heard Vaktar's words, she realized he was talking about something she had been studying. Her whole career, they had no doctrine, Vaktar said. No traditional way of fighting that they felt they had to follow. When one plan failed, they tried another. When that failed, they tried something completely different. They were willing to break every rule of warfare if it meant survival. The general's words were having an effect on the other species in the fleet. The Ilari, who had been using the same energy attack patterns for 50,000 years, began to experiment with new frequencies. The Zephyrians started ignoring their perfect calculations and making random attacks. The Vorthak abandoned their traditional honor charges and began using guerrilla tactics. "That species saved us all," Vaktar continued. "Not because they were better warriors, but because they were willing to become better warriors. They learned from every battle, adapted to every situation, and never made the same mistake twice." Lieutenant Commander Tony Rodriguez was leading another boarding party, this time onto a harvester ship that was still fully operational. It was a suicide mission by any reasonable standard, but human standards were not always reasonable. As he listened to Vaktar's voice through his helmet radio, he understood why his crazy plan might actually work. "Those warriors taught me the most important lesson of my long life," Vaktar said. "They showed me that the greatest strength is not in having the perfect plan, but in being willing to abandon any plan that stops working." The ancient general paused again, and this time his voice became stronger, more urgent. "Today I see those same warriors again," he said. They call themselves humans now, and they come from a world called Earth. They have the same spirit, the same refusal to give up, the same willingness to try the impossible. Admiral Kexthara felt something he had not experienced in decades. It was not fear or anger or confusion. It was hope. For the first time since the war began, he thought they might actually have a chance to win. "Watch how they fight," Wachter said. "The humans do not follow the rules of engagement that we have all accepted. They use weapons we consider primitive, tactics we consider desperate, and strategies we consider impossible. And they are winning." Captain Hayes looked at his tactical display and saw that it was true. The human ships were still in the fight, still causing damage to the Harvester fleet, while many of the advanced alien vessels had been destroyed or forced to retreat. "They are not fighting this war the way we fight wars," Wachter continued. "They are fighting it the way wars should be fought, with creativity, with desperation, with the absolute refusal to accept defeat." The general's voice grew stronger, and everyone in the fleet could hear the passion in his words. "The Harvesters can adapt to our weapons because our weapons follow patterns they can understand. They can counter our strategies because our strategies are based on logic they can process. But they cannot adapt to chaos. They cannot counter madness. They cannot process the impossible." Dr. Clark understood now why the Harvesters were having trouble with human tactics. Human behavior was not just chaotic. It was creatively chaotic. Humans did not just break rules randomly. They broke rules in ways that created new opportunities. "I have studied the humans for months," Wachter said. "I have read their military history, learned about their wars, analyzed their methods. They have spent their entire existence fighting each other on a world that tried to kill them every day. They have turned survival into an art form." The ancient warrior began to describe human battles from Earth's history. He talked about small armies defeating large ones, about soldiers who kept fighting when they should have surrendered, about victories that came from desperation rather than strength. "At a place called Thermopylae, 300 warriors held off an army of thousands," he said. "They knew they could not win, but they fought anyway. They changed the course of history by refusing to accept the inevitable." He talked about other battles, other impossible victories. He described how humans had learned to fight in jungles and deserts and cities and in space against enemies who were stronger and better equipped. "At Normandy, they attacked the most heavily defended coastline in the world," Wachter said. "The casualties were terrible, the odds were against them. But they succeeded because they were willing to pay any price for victory." Beth Turner realized that Wachter was not just telling stories. He was explaining why humans fought the way they did, why they were willing to take risks that other species would never consider. "The humans do not fight for glory or honor or conquest," Wachter said. "They fight for the simple right to keep fighting. They have made warfare itself into their greatest weapon." The general's voice became quieter, more personal. "I am old," he said. "I have seen civilizations rise and fall, watched species come and go. I thought I had seen every kind of warrior that the galaxy could produce. But these humans have shown me something new." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried 3,000 years of experience. "They have shown me that the greatest warriors are not those who never lose," he said. "They are those who never stop trying to win." The effect of Wachter's words on the fleet was immediate and dramatic. Ships that had been retreating turned around and rejoined the battle. Crews that had been demoralized began fighting with new energy. Species that had been using the same tactics for millennia began experimenting with human-style improvisation. "The Harvesters are not invincible," Wachter said. "They are just machines, and machines can be broken. But they cannot be broken by following the same patterns they have already learned to counter. They can only be broken by warriors who are willing to break themselves first." The ancient general fell silent, but his words continued to echo through the fleet. For the first time since the war began, the galactic forces were fighting like humans, and for the first time since the war began, the Harvesters were losing. Admiral Kexthara had never asked for help from anyone in his entire military career. The Vorthak were proud warriors who solved their own problems with strength and courage. But now, standing on the bridge of his damaged flagship with half his fleet destroyed, he did something that would have been impossible just hours before. He opened a communication channel to the human fleet. "Commander Morrison," he said, his voice carrying across space to the small human command ship, "I am requesting that you take tactical command of the combined fleet operations." The words felt strange in his mouth. A few days ago he had dismissed the humans as children playing with toys. Now he was asking them to lead the most important battle in galactic history. Jake Morrison was as surprised as everyone else to receive the call. He had been watching the battle from his command ship, the UNS Liberty, seeing how Vaktar's words had changed everything. The other species were starting to fight like humans, but they needed someone who actually understood human tactics to coordinate their efforts. "Admiral," Jake replied, "I accept the responsibility, but we need to work together. This is not about humans leading other species. This is about all of us learning from each other." Within an hour, the entire command structure of the galactic fleet had changed. Human officers were working alongside alien commanders, sharing ideas and strategies that had never been tried before. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, and that made all the difference. Major Chris Johnson found himself leading the strangest military unit in galactic history. His boarding party consisted of humans, Vorthak heavy troops, Ilari energy beings, and even a few Zephyrian crystal warriors. They were preparing to attack the largest harvester ship anyone had ever seen, a massive vessel that was coordinating the enemy fleet. "Listen up," Chris said to his mixed species team. "We are going to do something that none of our species have ever done before. We are going to fight together, not as separate groups, but as one unit." The Vorthak soldiers looked confused. They were used to charging straight at the enemy with overwhelming force. The idea of working with smaller, weaker allies was foreign to them. "I do not understand," said Captain Thokvar, the leader of the Vorthak troops. "How can we fight effectively when we must slow down to accommodate others?" Chris smiled. "We are not slowing down. We are speeding up. Watch and learn." The boarding pods launched toward the harvester mothership like a swarm of angry insects. The enemy's defensive systems tried to stop them, but the pods were using human evasive maneuvers that the harvesters had never seen before. They twisted and turned unpredictably, making them almost impossible to target. When the pods reached the enemy ship, the real innovation began. Instead of using traditional breach tactics, the boarding party combined their different abilities in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. The Vorthak troops used their strength to tear open hull plates, while the humans used their explosives to create entry points in unexpected locations. The Ilari flowed through the openings as pure energy, disabling electrical systems from the inside. The Zephyrians calculated the ship's structural weak points and guided the others to the most effective targets. "This is incredible," Thokvar said as they fought their way through the ship's corridors. "We are accomplishing more together than any of our species could alone." Chris nodded while he set an explosive charge on what looked like a power conduit. "That is the human way of fighting. We adapt, we improvise, and we never fight fair if we can help it." Meanwhile, Engineer Amy Walsh was working on another revolutionary idea. She had taken Ellery energy weapons and modified them with human targeting systems, creating hybrid weapons that fired in patterns the harvesters could not predict or counter. "The key is randomness," she explained to Dr. Zathari, an Ilari energy specialist who was helping with the modifications. "Your weapons are perfect, but perfect means predictable. We need to make them imperfect on purpose." Dr. Zathari was struggling to understand the concept. "But why would we want our weapons to be less accurate?" "Because less accurate does not mean less effective," Amy replied. "If the enemy cannot predict where you are going to shoot, they cannot defend against it." The hybrid weapons were a success beyond anyone's expectations. The modified energy beams fired in erratic patterns that confused the harvester defense systems. Ships that had been adapting to every attack suddenly found themselves unable to cope with weapons that seemed to malfunction randomly. The new tactics spread through the fleet like wildfire. Vortex ships began using human hit-and-run strategies instead of their traditional frontal assaults. Ilari energy beings started varying their attack frequencies in chaotic patterns. Zephyrian crystal ships abandoned their perfect formations and began moving unpredictably. Captain Nick Barnes was commanding the Inn's Courage, one of the smaller human ships that had joined the main battle. He was demonstrating something that the other species found difficult to understand: the human concept of strategic retreat. "Fall back to position 7, he ordered his crew as a group of harvester ships approached their location. "Sir," his weapons officer said, "we could hold this position. Our shields are still at 60%. 60% is not enough," Nick replied. "We retreat now so we can fight again later. Dead heroes do not win wars." This was a concept that the Vorthik found particularly hard to accept. Their military culture was built around honor and courage, which meant never retreating from a fight. But they were learning that human courage was different. It was not about never being afraid. It was about being afraid and fighting anyway. It was not about never retreating. It was about knowing when to retreat so you could win the next battle. Admiral Kexthara watched from his flagship as the human tactics transformed his fleet. Ships that had been fighting individually were now working together in ways he had never imagined possible. The rigid command structure that had served the Vorthak for thousands of years was being replaced by something more flexible, more adaptive, human. "Tactics are chaos," he said to his communications officer. "But it is controlled chaos. It has purpose." Dr. Susan Clark had made a breakthrough that would change how everyone understood the enemy. She had been studying the harvester behavior patterns for hours, watching how they responded to different types of attacks. What she discovered was both simple and revolutionary. "The harvesters are not just adapting to our weapons," she reported to the fleet command. "They are adapting to our thinking patterns." Every species in the galaxy has logical, predictable thought processes. Even when we try to be random, we follow patterns that can be analyzed and countered. Jake Morrison was listening to her report from his command ship. "What makes humans different?" "Humans do not just think outside the box," Susan replied. "You do not even acknowledge that there is a box? Your entire evolutionary history has been about surviving impossible situations by doing impossible things." She pulled up data on her screen showing the psychological profiles of different species. The Vorthik think in terms of honor and strength. The Ilari think in terms of energy and efficiency. The Zephyrians think in terms of logic and calculation. But humans think in terms of survival at any cost. This revelation explained why human tactics were so effective against the harvesters. The enemy could adapt to logical thought patterns, but they could not adapt to the kind of creative desperation that had kept humans alive on Earth for millions of years. Tony Rodriguez and his boarding party had reached the command center of the Harvester mothership. What they found there was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The center was a massive chamber filled with flowing metal and pulsing lights, like the inside of a living computer. "How do we destroy this?" asked one of the Vorthik soldiers. Tony looked around the chamber, studying the alien technology. Everything was connected. Everything was part of a perfect system designed to coordinate the entire harvester fleet. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "We do not destroy it," he said finally. "We break it." Instead of trying to understand how the command center worked, the boarding party simply began damaging random components. They cut cables, smashed control panels, and set off explosives in places that looked important. It was not scientific or strategic. It was pure human vandalism applied to alien technology, but it worked. The Harvester mothership began to lose coordination with the rest of its fleet. Orders were not being transmitted correctly. Battle plans were being corrupted. The perfect machine that was the Harvester Armada was starting to break down. "The enemy fleet is showing signs of disorganization," reported the tactical officer on Jake Morrison's command ship. Their formation is starting to fall apart. Jake looked at the battle display and saw something that had been impossible just hours before. The Harvester fleet, which had seemed invincible at the start of the battle, was now showing weakness. Their ships were still dangerous, but they were no longer fighting as a coordinated unit. "All ships," he announced to the combined fleet, "prepare for final assault. Remember what General Wachter said, we are not just fighting to win this battle. We are fighting to prove that the impossible is possible." The Galactic Fleet, now fighting with human tactics and human determination, began its final push against the Harvester Armada. The final battle lasted 18 hours. Commander Jake Morrison coordinated the attack from his command ship, watching as thousands of vessels from 47 different species fought together using tactics that had never been tried before in galactic history. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely insane, which made it perfectly human. "All units, execute pattern Chaos 7, Jake ordered into his communicator. He had stopped using official military terminology hours ago. The other species were learning that human battle language was more about attitude than accuracy. The combined fleet moved like a living thing, constantly changing shape and direction. Vorthak heavy cruisers worked alongside tiny human fighters. Ilari energy beings flowed between Zephyrian crystal ships, creating light shows that confused the Harvester targeting systems. It was not the kind of coordinated attack that military schools taught, but it was working. Captain Ryan Hayes was leading the final assault on the Harvester Command Cluster, a group of massive ships that had been directing the enemy fleet. His ship, the Un's Defiance, was held together with spare parts and determination, but it was still fighting. "Sir," his weapons officer reported, "we have used all our nuclear torpedoes and most of our kinetic rounds. We are down to emergency ammunition." Ryan looked at his tactical display. The Harvester ships were damaged, but not destroyed. They were adapting to the human weapons, learning to counter the chaotic attacks. In a few more hours they might figure out how to defend against everything the Galactic Fleet could throw at them. "Then we get creative," Ryan said. "Load the cargo bay doors with industrial explosives. We are going to ram them." It was the kind of plan that would have horrified any reasonable military officer. Ships were expensive and took years to build. Crews were trained and experienced. Throwing them away in suicide attacks was wasteful and desperate, but desperate was exactly what the situation called for. "Sir," his communications officer said, "Admiral Kexthara is asking about our status. Tell him we are about to do something." "Stupid," Ryan replied, and asked him to cover our approach. The Defiance accelerated toward the largest Harvester ship, its hull groaning under the stress of maximum engine power. Around it, other human ships were making similar attacks, turning themselves into guided missiles with crews that could think and adapt, but they were not alone. Vorthak ships were following their example, abandoning their traditional honor codes to make desperate attacks that might save the fleet. Ilari energy beings were overloading their own power cores to create explosions that could damage enemy ships. Even the logical Zephyrians were making attacks that their computers said had almost no chance of success. "Impact in 30 seconds, Ryan's pilot announced. "All hands prepare for a collision." The Harvester ship tried to destroy the approaching vessel with defensive fire, but the Defiance was moving too unpredictably. It twisted and turned like a wounded animal, making it almost impossible to target effectively when the collision came. It was like a small star exploding. The Defiance's hull cracked open and its cargo of industrial explosives detonated all at once. The Harvester ship staggered, its perfect black hull cracking and splitting. For a moment, it looked like the attack had failed, then the enemy ship began to break apart. Its internal systems, damaged beyond repair, started to shut down one by one. The lights went out, the weapons stopped firing, and the massive vessel began to drift helplessly through space. "Direct hit," Jake Morrison announced to the fleet. "The command ship is down." But the victory came at a cost. The Defiance was gone, along with most of its crew. Ryan Hayes had survived the collision, but his ship was nothing more than scattered debris floating in space. Similar scenes were playing out across the battlefield. Ships from every species were making desperate attacks, sacrificing themselves to damage the enemy. It was not the clean, efficient victory that military planners preferred, but it was effective. The Harvester fleet was falling apart. Without coordination from their command ships, the individual vessels were fighting independently, making them vulnerable to the coordinated attacks of the galactic forces. Major Chris Johnson and his mixed-species boarding party had captured 3 more Harvester ships using tactics that combined the best abilities of every species represented. They had learned to fight as a single unit, with humans providing creativity, Vorthek providing strength, Ilari providing energy manipulation, and Zephyrians providing precise calculations. "We make a good team," Captain Thokvar said as they secured another enemy vessel. The Vorthek warrior had blood running down his scales from multiple wounds, but he was still fighting. "The best," Chris agreed. "Maybe we should make this arrangement permanent after the war." It was a radical idea. The different species had been fighting separately for thousands of years, each convinced that their way was the only correct way. But the war had shown them that cooperation was not just possible. It was more effective than anything they had tried before. Engineer Amy Walsh had perfected her hybrid weapons, and the designs were spreading through the fleet faster than anyone had thought possible. Ships that had been using the same weapon systems for centuries were now carrying human-modified equipment that fired in patterns the Harvesters could not counter. "The key is controlled randomness," she explained to a group of alien engineers who were trying to understand her modifications. "You want your weapons to be unpredictable to the enemy, but still accurate enough to hit your target." Dr. Susan Clark was monitoring the psychological impact of the battle on both sides. The galactic forces were fighting with a confidence they had never shown before, while the Harvesters were showing signs of something that looked almost like confusion. "They are programmed to adapt to any threat," she reported to Jake Morrison. "But they cannot adapt to threats that change faster than their adaptation protocols can process. We are essentially overloading their learning systems with too much chaos to handle." As the battle entered its final phase, General Wachter spoke again. His voice came over the communication channels, reaching every ship in both fleets. 3,000 years ago, I watched the galaxy learn its greatest lesson, the ancient warrior said. Today, I have watched you learn it again. The greatest strength is not in having the perfect plan. It is in being willing to abandon any plan that stops working. Jake Morrison was coordinating the final attacks on the remaining Harvester ships. There were still hundreds of enemy vessels, but they were no longer fighting as a coordinated force. They were individual ships trying to survive, and survival was something humans understood better than anyone. "The war is not over," Wachter continued, "but the outcome is no longer in doubt. You have learned to fight like humans, and humans do not lose wars. They may lose battles, they may suffer defeats, but they never stop trying to win." The ancient general paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of millennia. "I am old," he said. "I have lived longer than any being should, seen more wars than any warrior needs to see. But today I have seen something that makes all those years worthwhile. I have seen the galaxy learn that its greatest strength comes not from its most advanced technology or its most powerful weapons. It comes from its willingness to never give up." Admiral Kexthara was watching the battle from his damaged flagship when the last Harvester command ship finally surrendered. It was something that had never happened before in the entire war. The machines had always fought to the death, never showing any sign of self-preservation. But now, faced with attacks they could not counter and tactics they could not understand, the remaining Harvester ships were powering down their weapons and sending surrender signals. "It is over," Kexthara announced to the fleet. "The enemy is defeated." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Ships from 47 different species, many of them former enemies, were working together to rescue survivors and repair damage. The barriers that had separated the species for thousands of years had been broken down in a single battle. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to admiral and appointed as the first human member of the Galactic Defense Council. It was an honor that would have been impossible just days before, but the war had changed everything. The galaxy owes humanity a debt it can never repay, Admiral Kexthara said during the promotion ceremony. You have taught us that our greatest enemy was not the harvesters, it was our own rigid thinking. Dr. Susan Clark was asked to establish the first human military academy on Zentara Prime, where officers from every species could come to study what they were calling human doctrine, the art of abandoning doctrine when necessary. We will teach them to think like humans, she explained to the Galactic Council. Not to replace their own ways of thinking, but to add human flexibility to their existing strengths. The Academy would become one of the most important institutions in the galaxy, producing officers who combine the best qualities of every species with the adaptive thinking that had won the war, General Wachter, in his final recorded statement, before returning to his long retirement, made a prediction that would prove to be accurate. The galaxy has learned its most important lesson, he said. Future conflicts will not be won by the strongest or most advanced species.